بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الرجاء من الحضور الذين يريدون أو يرغبون بالاستماع إلى هذه المحاضرة باللغة العربية النقر على الزر الذي يشبه الكرة الأرضية بالأسفل للاستماع إلى الترجمة العربية. Greetings everyone for attending this newest event hosted by the Asian Studies program at the King Faisal Center for Research and Islamic Studies. This is part of an ongoing series in which we invite scholars and experts from around the globe to discuss on issues related to domestic politics, international relations, cultural and social developments in various Asian polities, including China, among many others. Today, we are very much honored to have with us Dr. Julia Strauss, who is a professor of Chinese politics in the School of Oriental and African Studies in SOAS, University of London. Her research interests have panned both sides of the Taiwan Straits. That will be very obvious from this lecture today. A lot of her research focuses on state institutional building, governance, and the performative dimensions of politics, as well as the environment. She has also conducted research in relation to Africa and Latin America and China's engagement with that region. She has edited multiple volumes under Cambridge University Press, including one on the history of the People's Republic of China, another on the Great Wall to the New World, China and Latin America in the 21st century, and another edited volume under the title of China and Africa, Emerging Patterns in Globalization and Development. I think all of us are very much interested in listening to this particular lecture, which builds up on one of her more recent books, as well as her studies looking at the success of state building and state outcomes on both sides of the Taiwan Straits. But before we begin, I'd like to just lay down a few ground rules. The lecture will follow the typical format we've followed for past events. The speaker will have something around 35 to 40 minutes to speak, after which we will offer room to the audience to pose their questions and raise their comments. I ask the audience to use the Q&A function to write down any of their questions, as we will not be taking, except with extreme exceptions, audio-visual questions or comments. And beyond that, and without further ado, Dr. Strauss, the floor is yours. And thank you again for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. I think I need to, you have to stop the sharing of your screen so that I can share my screen. There we go. Let's try that again. All right. All right, is that visible? Okay, great. Okay, so the topic of my talk is state building in China and Taiwan, bureaucratic campaign and performance. It should actually be bureaucracy, campaign, and performance in the early 1950s. And why this focus on state building in the early 1950s? I mean, it's, however many years, 70 years later. Why is this relevant? Well, it's relevant for state building, I think, in general, because the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China in the early 1950s was a quite unusual kind of thing, in that it gives us a case of two regimes that actually had quite a lot in common and yet diverged in other accelerating different directions after a very short period of time. And so the Chinese Civil War, 45-49, produced a very, very unexpected outcome in 1949 and early 1950, namely the establishment of two Chinese states vastly unequal in scale, the very large People's Republic of China and the now very small and truncated Republic of China. The Republic of China had been the legitimate government that was recognized internationally of all of China between about 1927, the late 1920s and 1949. And after losing the Civil War very badly, it retreated to the island of Taiwan, where it reconstituted and set itself up there as a sort of rump regime. And what is kind of unusual is that by the mid-1950s, both were well consolidated and yet also unusually successful exemplars of two very different regime types: the revolutionary People's Republic of China and the conservative, excuse me, the conservative authoritarian Republic of China. Now, we know that this is so, but there's been surprisingly little work on how this became so. And what I mean by how this became so, the mechanisms and the strategies that underlay each, and the ways in which there was movement over time between a set of surprising shared similarities in these two regimes in 1949, 1950, to increasingly distinct differences and accelerating differences over the course of the 1950s. So we have to ask ourselves, well, yeah, but why should we be thinking about China and Taiwan in the early 1950s? And I think there are a couple of reasons why this comparison excuse me, is still relevant. First, in the realm of post-World War II new states, there are only a relatively few number of cases in which we can engage this kind of deep comparison while holding culture and structure constant.
Would you prefer to have a break maybe and get some water?
No. My throat just acts up sometimes. So we have North and South Korea. North and South Vietnam would also be candidates. And when we look at China, there is a problem of methodology in that the size of the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China and Taiwan are very different. One was very large, one was very small. And so the way I work around this problem is to focus not on all of the People's Republic of China, but on Sunan, the relatively wealthy and developed region around Shanghai, as a comparator for Taiwan, because both of these regions of Greater China were relatively developed for the time, both had industry, both had a lot of infrastructural investment, and both had very substantial movement already in 1949 out of subsistence agriculture. And so what's really surprising is that despite enormous mutual hostility and rhetorical claims of being very, very different from each other, there were in fact substantial overlaps in structure, in assumptions, and in state building agendas in these two Chinese regimes in 1949. So here is a quick list of structural conditions and normative assumptions that were shared by the People's Republic of China and the Republic of China, now in Taiwan. And then I have a little next column about whether these issues and structural conditions and normative assumptions are common in developing states in general. So regional insecurity and heavy militarization, yes and yes. Outsider aspiration to reassert central control, yes and yes. A monocratic party state, yes, shared by the PRC and ROC, variable, sometimes yes and sometimes no in other developing states. A high modernist commitment to science and development, yes and variable, I would say. The presumption of the amenability of citizens to state instruction rather than simple coercion, yes and probably no. The state to play a very important role in ensuring subsistence and a form of social justice, yes, shared by both in PRC and ROC Taiwan, no, not so much in most developing states. a deep suspicion of all associational activity not directly overseen by the state? Yes, PRC and ROC. No, not really in most developing states. And finally, a desire to impose order, vision, and communicate norms rapidly to a subject population. Yes, for PRC and ROC, variable, I would say, in developing states. But states aren't static. This earlier typology suggests, well, these are just features. But states are not static. They implement and they perform policies. When what I mean by performing policies is that they attempt to implement preferences and choices, and the ways that they do so are distinctive. They are performed in distinctive ways that transmit regime norms, that persuade populations, and that attempt to build regime legitimacy. So in my view, policy implementation is never only about implementing a policy and getting it done, but it's also about reinforcing, and we're in this case, these cases, building the state in the ways in which policies are implemented. And what I see in the case of the PRC in Sunan and the ROC in Taiwan is that policies were performed through a shifting mix of bureaucratic and campaign modalities performed in contrasting registers, namely public emotional mobilization for the PRC and procedural rectitude and austerity for the ROC. So here's another quick juxtaposition. Bureaucratic and campaign modalities of policy implementation. What do I mean by bureaucratic and campaign? Well, bureaucracies, the bureaucratic mode is hierarchical, and the campaign is varying hierarchy and egalitarian participation. The bureaucratic mode engages by definition in regular ongoing rulemaking, often based on precedent, whereas a campaign modality is an extraordinary, by definition, extraordinary short-term mobilization of material and human resources to accomplish a set goal or complex of closely related goals. The bureaucratic modality is depersonalized and delimited, whereas the campaign mobilizes normative and emotional commitments, often bleeding into other campaigns. And perhaps most interestingly, the bureaucratic modality of policy implementation simplifies complex realities by disaggregating wholes into standard categories that can then be measured and recorded. The campaign, on the other hand, simplifies complex realities, but it does so in a very different way. The campaign simplifies complex realities through fusion, compression, and overarching narratives. So these different modalities of policy implementation really are very, very different. Now, when we look to Taiwan, the ROC on Taiwan, and the People's Republic of China in 1949, 1950, we see a huge amount of regime insecurity. And as a result, there were both the ROC and the PRC launched campaigns of terror as a strategy of regime consolidation and state formation. So why this focus on terror and insecurity? Well, because anywhere at any time, domestic security is one of the most important preconditions for regime consolidation. If you don't have domestic security and regional security, you don't have much. In addition, in the early 1950s, both of these regimes were operating in a regional security theater that was deeply insecure. This was the time of the Korean War, and there was a great deal of anxiety about regional insecurity. And indeed, given the unresolved nature of the Civil War, there certainly were some spies and some subversives and some sympathizers on each side of the Taiwan Strait working for the other side to try to undermine the regime from within. All of these things are true. It was regionally insecure. Yes, there were some spies. Yes, there were sympathizers for the other side. But what is very clear when you begin to look at the documents is that the PRC in Sunan and the ROC in Taiwan both explicitly and deliberately resorted to campaigns of terror, not only because of regional insecurity, but as an excuse. to launch campaigns of terror against presumptive domestic enemies to consolidate the state. So in the early 1950s, we had two campaigns going on more or less simultaneously on the two sides of the Taiwan Straits. In the PRC in Sunan, it was called the Campaign to Suppress Counter-Revolutionaries. In Taiwan, it wasn't really called anything at the time because they sort of minimized it, but it now is called the White Terror. But it was referred to at the time by authorities in Taiwan as martial law that had campaign bursts of enforcement. So in 1950, the Campaign to Suppress Counter-Revolutionaries came about. It was brewing through the summer of 1950, and it was launched officially in the autumn, in October of 1950. But it didn't really reach its crescendo as a campaign until the spring of 1951 in Sunan. Whereas in Taiwan, you had an acceleration and a consolidation of the instruments of terror around about the autumn of 1949, which is when they started to keep reasonable records, with intensification throughout 1950 to 53, rapid drop-off of actual enforcement and actual terror in 1954 as the system became much more bureaucratized. And martial law continued until 1987. But there was nothing like the terror of the early 1950s. Whereas in contrast, in the People's Republic of China, there was the major campaign in 50-51, another Sufan campaign to clean out revolutionaries in 1955. This widened with later campaigns against rightists in 1957, another Sufan campaign in 1960, and then, of course, eventually the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to 1976, which was all about worries about counter-revolutionaries in the realm of culture. So you have a contrast where you have a first campaign in Sunan, and then later campaigns that become more and more extreme. Whereas in Taiwan, you have a really sharp burst of enforcement and campaign of terror in the early 1950s, and then a real drop-off to almost nothing. When we look at the scale of 1950-51 and the early 1950s in Taiwan, we do have, amazingly, a very good set of numbers. Probably can't get it now, but I could get it back when I was doing the research. 14,391 counter-revolutionaries sentenced in Shanghai. So that's 0.24% of a population of around 6 million. And an almost even exact 20% of those sentenced were executed. We know now that quotas were handed down for this. And it gets trickier to think about scale of terror in Taiwan because the numbers that we have are inconclusive and they are in contradiction with each other. But my own very conservative estimate is that there were something on the order of 11,672 rebels sentenced, or 0.14% of the population of around 8 million. And when we get to the execution rates, though, it varies. It varies tremendously because people were not arrested as single people. They were arrested as part of what was called anjian, or cases. And a case could be very small with only 1 or 2 people, or it could be very large with 50 or 100 people. And the documents are organized around cases. And here, sometimes there was very light punishment or almost no punishment, but in some cases, anjian, which had many different people, brought in and prosecuted as a whole case. The execution rates could be 20%, 30%, and in one case up to 57%. When we look at who actually was sentenced, we see in the People's Republic of China that only half of the people who were sentenced and executed in the Campaign to Suppress Counter-Revolutionaries, only half of them were political counter-revolutionaries by any means. The other half were either real or potential social or economic competitors for the regime. They were called local bullies. They were called the leaders of counter-revolutionary sects. They were called smugglers. They were called sometimes like local hoodlums hanging out on the street. So only about half were, by any stretch of the imagination, counter-revolutionaries as a political category in the People's Republic of China. In Taiwan, it's very, very clear that many, many times more people were sentenced and executed in the White Terror than there were members of the Chinese Communist Party in Taiwan. The numbers of members of Chinese Communist Party and their sympathizers in Taiwan are unclear. One figure that I got was that there was from an oral history was that there was a maximum of around 2,000. Most of the documents I've seen suggest that it was something around 1,000 to 1,200. So if we look at my very conservative estimate of 11,000 sentenced, far, far many more people in Taiwan were sentenced than there were members of the Chinese Communist Party. Others were soldiers suspected of different factional loyalties, people who were sympathetic to the left, independence-minded Taiwanese, people who were mildly socialist, people who were just unlucky and were caught reading the wrong thing at the wrong time. All right, so if we think about the instrumentality of terror campaigns, both of these campaigns of terror were very, very much wrapped up in extending the reach of the state. So in both cases, this prosecution of counter-revolutionaries or rebels was a way that the state got rid of and cleared the ground of political competitors, economic competitors, and social undesirables. And in the case of the PRC, the campaign was a means to extend the Chinese Communist Party's control into large factories, begin to establish security committees, and enforce the compliance of private actors. In the case of Taiwan, the martial law extraordinary regulations were a deliberate means to extend Republic of China security organizations in surveillance, to set up networks of informers, to set up special detachments of paramilitaries to go up into the mountains where under the pretext of rooting out communists who fled up into the mountains. And in both cases, the regime engaged in bait and switch. Both had a presumption of guilt that if you were accused, you were guilty unless otherwise proven. And in many cases, there was an explicit bait and switch. Come forward, we'll offer lenience, come and confess your crimes, and then we'll go lightly on you. And then, well, sometimes they went lightly, and in a lot of cases they didn't. However, it is when you start to, so there were all of these different features that these two regimes had in common in the instrumentality of the prosecution of anti-terror campaigns. But we begin to see real differences in the performance of the campaign. So one way in which you perform the campaign is that you prepare the public through official propaganda. And here there is a huge contrast between the two. The image on the left is Towu, or special agent. Where are you running to? So you have the figure of the socialist, either worker or army guy, PLA army guy, shining a flashlight on the evil counter-revolutionary who's sneaking away. And he has vaguely Western features and he's wearing vaguely Western clothes. And you can see that he has a knife dripping blood of the blood of the people. And he's tangled up in his wireless transmitter. And so there's this, it's a marvelous image of humor and also, sort of righteous crushing of the evil counter-revolutionary who kind of actually looks a little bit like a cockroach, I think. Whereas the other image to the right, I apologize for the graininess of this image, but this is a very short document that announces the arrest of the top committee of the Communist Party in Taiwan. It's a very, very short announcement in the national newspaper. It simply states that this gang has been arrested and apprehended, and it simply lists their names, where they're from, and their ages. So you contrast the terseness and literally the lack of color and humor of the ROC Taiwan with the color and the humor of the People's Republic of China in propaganda. And this gives you some sense of where we're going to be going. So when the campaign was actually performed, they not only were the campaigns performed in a different way, but each side was very clear that it needed to be seen to be different in juxtaposition and in opposition to those awful people over there on the other side of the Taiwan Strait. So in the People's Republic of China in Sunan, their campaign was openly, joyously performed and affirmed as casting out the evil, unreconstructed, awful counter-revolutionaries from beyond the pale as part of righteous class struggle. Whereas in Taiwan, it was all about legality. We set up martial law, we set up rules, we set up courts, we set up institutions. So it's all about legality, procedure, denial of scale. In the People's Republic of China in Sunan, there were rapid, sharp strikes against counter-revolutionaries in public, very, very much in public space. In Taiwan, rapid, sharp strikes in secret with the midnight knock on the door. With then, you're asleep, and the wife and kids are going, "Whoa, what's going on? What's going on?" And you're hauled out of bed, and then you may never be seen again. In the People's Republic in Sunan, it was all about emotion and drama and public coming together. In Taiwan, it was all about procedure and rectitude and law. Now, the law was bogus. They were just making up the laws, they were going on. But the campaign was performed as law and legality. So in my next slide, performing terror, participatory campaign versus concealed procedure. So in red, obviously, I have the People's Republic of China versus blue. Blue is the color of the Kuomintang in Taiwan, and how they performed the campaign. So for the Chinese Communist Party in Sunan, the type of performance against counter-revolutionaries was the Kong Su Hui, or the public accusation session, the public accusation meeting. Sometimes these were also called Dou Zhong Hui, or struggle sessions. So these were meetings in public. Whereas in Taiwan, it was the martial law sentencing hearing. The how of performance was through the deliberate whipping up of the emotions of a very large crowd, with ideally something called a gaochao, or a high tide of righteous emotion and revulsion against evil counter-revolutionaries being unleashed spontaneously by the crowd. Whereas in Taiwan, the animating how of the performance was the reiteration of reified law, i.e. state decisions made by impersonally applied rules. The players and the stage in Sunan pre-coached victims, engaging with face-to-face accusation against the evil counter-revolutionary in public space outside. So 面对面, face-to-face accusation in public, which is galvanizing the crowd into its gaochao, or high tide. Whereas in Taiwan, the players on the stage are the accused, the judge, and the military guards inside the prison. So not in public space at all. It's official space, but it's enclosed and private, at least privatized, in the sense of no members of the public were permitted to attend. And the audience were in the respective audiences of these performances were a little bit different. In the People's Republic of China, the main audience was the masses, the Chunzhong. The masses gathered to witness this spectacle of counter-revolutionaries being accused in public. And the idea was that through the gaochao and the high tide of emotion, that the masses would merge, the individuals in the masses would merge with each other as a collectivity, and also merge with the state and what the state wanted in carrying out executions against evil counter-revolutionaries. Whereas in Taiwan, it seems that the main audience for these events, the martial law sentencing hearing, was the state itself. The public and even the relatives of the accused only learned about these things at several removes, often through a very, very short and terse official announcement of the sort that we've already seen. So, okay, here we go. Now, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So here we have the performing trials of subversives, and you can see the difference between the two. On the left, I apologize for this being quite dark. This is a public accusation session of a counter-revolutionary, probably somewhere in north of the Yangtze River. This was not in Shanghai because this was published as part of propaganda before the sharp strikes in Shanghai at the end of April 1951. So this event probably took place somewhere north of the Yangtze River. I'm guessing somewhere in Jiangsu. It doesn't say in the actual reportage on this, but you can see. But it's important because this is the propaganda of what a public accusation meeting was supposed to look like against counter-revolutionaries. And you can sort of make out, the first thing that you notice is that this event is held outside. And there is a stage where the counter-revolutionaries, sort of the bald guy, who's being held by two People's Liberation Army soldiers. And you can't really tell from this image because it's shrunken down, but the army soldiers are holding a rope around the neck of the accused so that when the accusation is read out, if the guy doesn't fall to his knees, when the cadre who's on the stage but at an angle so that you can't really see him says drop to your knees, he drops to his knees. And if he doesn't drop to his knees, he gets choked and he drops to his knees. The accuser, who's down to the left, is a woman, and you can see that her arm is waving. I have other photographs from other angles of this event, and it's very clear that she's in motion the whole time, and she's holding a microphone because this crowd is so large that she needs to be mic'd in order to be heard. So a sea of faces, a female accuser, and the event is taking place on a raised platform. Literally, it's on a stage. Contrast this with Taiwan. This is the sentencing hearing of a pretty important military guy by the name of Wu Shi, and his courier. His courier is the woman. And here, it's almost a complete inversion of the image to the left. This event, which is a sentencing hearing, is being held inside a prison, probably the room is very small. You can see that it's surrounded by a black curtain, and that you have three people in the dock, but the judge, you can see that there's a platform just down in the right bottom corner. It is the judge who's raised above the accused rather than the accused being on the stage. So it's inside rather than outside. It's in government official space, but closed off, concealed space. There are many, many more guards than there are the accused. There are no members of the public present. And it's the judge who's raised up kind of off screen rather than the accused who's above, being witnessed from the crowd below. So it seems in this case that the audience is the guards and also the people who are enacting state official procedure being martial law. And so you see this guy who's in an army uniform leaning into Wu Shi, and he's making sure that Wu Shi officially writes in a brush and acknowledges each of the charges against him. So he's leaning in, making sure that the accused officially recognizes and accepts the charges against him so that the whole thing can then be filed. So it's a very, very different audience. It's a very different setting. What is being performed is really very different indeed. So we need to ask ourselves why these insistence on such different performances. Well, there's a number of different reasons for this. The how needed to be publicly performed to demonstrate regime norms to a wider, larger public set of audiences. The hows laid down public claims to regime legitimacy, not just what we are, but how we do things. The how educated the population into regime expectations and regime norms. In the People's Republic of China, in Sunan, the goal of these public accusation meetings was to forge new social bonds via popular mobilization and to reinforce public support of the regime in its extreme violence against defined enemies. Whereas in Taiwan, it was quite different. The goal in Taiwan under the Republic of China was to break apart old social bonds by atomizing people, by removing them from their families, removing them from their support structures, and literally isolating them in prison, even down to the point of the actual sentencing hearing. Okay, well, the results of these different performances were similar and different. So in the People's Republic of China in Sunan and in the Republic of China and Taiwan, the results of these different performances was identical. You dispatched the defined enemies of the state and then some. There was a lot of excess in both of these, and you cowed friends and family into silence. In the People's Republic of China and Sunan, there was the removal and the public display of the impure and the beyond the pale. Whereas in Taiwan, there was the removal and the sequestration of the impure and the beyond the pale. In Sunan, the People's Republic of China implemented a public and dramatic breakpoint in the revolution. This was for many people a moment of no return in the public demonstration of popular revolution. Whereas in Taiwan, what was being demonstrated was state-imposed legality, i.e., if you don't follow the rules that we post, and it's black and white, here are our rules, here are our rules, here are our rules, then you too may end up in prison and disappeared and never heard from again. Finally, the results of these different performances in the PRC instructed publics in new state-determined categories of revolutionary, counter-revolutionary, different types of counter-revolutionary, as well as enjoining popular participation, as well as complicity in the state's violence towards defined enemies. Whereas in Taiwan, there was a warning to publics to comply with state law and the atomization of individual families who fell under any kind of suspicion. In addition, both of these regimes, through their public performance of prosecution of counter-revolutionaries and rebels, established templates that were laid down early in the process of regime consolidation that were then repeated and repeated and repeated. So the People's Republic of China was establishing a template for the entirety of the country that repeated a successful set of repertoires and lessons learned by the Chinese Communist Party under Mao in its long years of revolution in North China, namely popular mobilization and the public merging with the state behind state-chosen targets, and that you might even think of them as state-chosen scapegoats. And the problem with this repertoire was that it worked very well. It worked very well for regime consolidation in the early 1950s with getting rid of landlords and re-educating intellectuals and getting rid of corrupt businessmen. But the problem was that once you get rid of the usual suspects, the deep attachment to this repertoire didn't go away. And it could only be turned inward once the usual suspects had been rounded up and dispatched, and they had all been rounded up and dispatched by about the end of 1953. And so attachment to this campaign repertoire, however, as part of how we do things, meant that later campaigns had vaguer targets, and these techniques were now being applied within the confines of the work unit rather than out there in open space. In Taiwan, the opposite lessons had been learned by the late 1940s, the experience of the late 1940s and the Civil War. In the early 1950s in Taiwan, what one saw was an absolute repudiation of the kinds of compromises and factionalism and co-optation that were felt by 1949, 1950, after much soul searching, to have led to such failure in China itself. So we're going to get rid of factionalism. We're going to get rid of co-optation. We're going to come in, we're going to establish a strong state. However, the Kuomintang came in as outsiders to Taiwan. And so the lessons learned were the lessons of failure rather than the lessons of success. And what this led to was a concentration in political will to launch highly effective, but also highly delimited campaigns. And these much more minimal legitimating performances of legality and process, frankly, required much less from the population in terms of demonstration of loyalty. Just following the rules and keeping your nose clean in the ROC was probably enough to keep you out of trouble. You had to be careful about what you said to whom, but the performances of martial law, legality, and process, in fact, required much less from the population compared to the campaign modality and the stirring up and the gaochao that was remained part of the repertoire in the People's Republic of China and Sunan and elsewhere after 1953. So I'm going to conclude shortly by talking a little bit about bureaucracy and campaign. Even when they're not explicitly recognized as such, bureaucratic and campaign modalities are, in fact, features of a very, very wide range of state systems. And I think that we might want to think more comparatively about how bureaucracy and campaign end up playing out in a range of different systems throughout the world. And in my own view, the nexus between bureaucratic and campaign modalities is a variable one, but to some extent, they're co-constitutive. Campaigns need the infrastructure and the coherence that only bureaucracy can provide. And under conditions of early state building and regime consolidation, they may very well lead to state expansion and state strengthening. And we see this in both the People's Republic of China and in the Republic of China, Taiwan in the early 1950s. But if they are taken to their logical conclusions, campaigns invariably undercut bureaucracy. So if we think some years ago about Turkey's campaign to rid the country of Gülenists in the civil service and in the judiciary. Well, nobody knew what a Gülenist was. Even Gülen himself didn't think that there was a conspiracy and there was such a thing as Gülenists. So I very much see the effort in Turkey to rid the country of Gülenists in the civil service and the judiciary as being very, very much like the anti-rightist campaign in China of 1957. It's sort of witch hunting, get rid of anybody who looks or ever has said anything that you probably didn't like or makes you fall under suspicion. And if we think further about performance also is around us everywhere. Now, the Young People's Republic of China celebrated a very particular constellation of participatory campaign and public performance with a very clear script, a very clear purpose. And it's quite easy to study because, in fact, there's a lot of documentation about this, and even documentation about how local cadres were supposed to prepare for these public performances, which I can talk about if you like in the question and answer period. But performance also features very, very prominently in other political environments, both authoritarian and democratic. And I would suggest that we think a little bit more about what performance means and how we might go about beginning to analyze it, who the protagonists are, what are the institutions and expectations that the performance is embedded in, whether performance either supports or undercuts the state, the kind of signals that the performance sends. So in the ROC in Taiwan, the performances were sequestered behind the opaque walls of the prison, and public counter performances were quashed, absolutely quashed. But campaigns, performance, and anti-bureaucracy is still very, very much with us. And I would turn in my final slides to something that isn't obvious at all in a talk on China in the 1950s, but the assault on the US Capitol building on January 6th of 2021. So not even a year has gone by. And here we see campaign mobilization outside the state, but encouraged from within, from the very top. And what you see in this, what I said was, it was stunning for someone who studies performance. This was a literal performative assault on bureaucracy, rules, procedure, as well as regular government institutions and norms. This is why this was a sacred space. It was unthinkable. And you see the demonstrators / the mob, the insurgents, coming in to the Capitol building. And here you see these really quite extraordinary props, costumes, and makeup with the self-styled shaman. This is an utterly bizarre costume, with horns, being bare-chested and carrying an American flag. Most of the other people coming in are wearing red Make America Great baseball caps. It, by the way, is completely out of line for anyone in the United States who isn't an active Trump supporter to wear a square red baseball cap anymore. My husband he had one of these things and he was like, no, this is too close. I got to get rid of it. Can't be wearing this. So symbols and their meaning and the costumes change over time, sometimes very quickly. We have occupation as a symbolic overturning of regularly ordered institutional space, with the taking of the occupation of the chair of the Speaker of the House here. And then this is the guy who literally took a selfie after he invaded Nancy Pelosi's office. So you have, private, regular workspace being literally invaded. And if you, look at his body language, he's expanding over the space, draping the American flag, reveling in this. So on these final notes, I think that maybe one of the things that we all want to start to think about a little bit more is this question of campaign performance and bureaucracy and these different modalities and how they intersect, not only in the state building of China on the two sides of the Taiwan Straits in the early 1950s, but perhaps more generally in a very, very wide range of different political environments and different political moments. Does the performance negate the bureaucratic and the rule bound, or does it support the bureaucratic and the rule bound? And on that, I will close.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strauss. This was a very eye-opening talk. I very much enjoyed it myself. I have a few questions, but before I pose them, I'd just like to remind the audience that if they have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A box, which you can find the tab for below. So, I'll just enjoy my prerogatives as being the moderator to pose questions. The first that I actually had among the two was whether you could tell us a bit more about sort of the continuities of these legacies. You've set up sort of bureaucracy versus performative campaigns as something that is ongoing and enmeshed in politics, right? Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, in terms of sort of the legacies and genealogies of the experience of state building in the early 1950s across Taiwan Strait, whether we can discern any of these sort of the echoes of these phenomenons in the current moment, whether in terms of how the states operate and govern. I mean, you've talked a bit about that in terms of them having much greater success in consolidating rule versus governing using, sort of these performative campaigns. But I'm wondering whether you see these sort of parallelist dynamics operating today. And sort of, as an ancillary question to that one, if you could share with us a bit of your thoughts about the current moment in mainland politics, because what we also see is sort of like a political politicization of the bureaucracy in a
Right.
way under Xi Jinping, and a much more active use also of campaigns, of disciplining, but without the populist component.
Right.
The populist aspect is kind of aesthetic.
Right.
Maybe you can answer that, and then I can ask the second question.
Okay. What I would say is that these legacies are still very much with us. At present, in the next couple of weeks, actually, I'm going to need to rewrite an introduction to a volume that I'm co-editing on the 1950s in PRC history in the 1950s in China. And this is one of the questions, exactly this question that we're dealing with. Why does this matter? Does this matter at all for now? And I would say that yes, it does, particularly for the People's Republic of China, because the regime is in the People's Republic of China now under Xi Jinping is very, very leery of any kind of popular participation that it doesn't control. And anytime you invite in a very large group of people and you stir them up or you allow them to be stirred up, it always carries the risk of veering out of control in a way that you can't necessarily foresee. And so this is very much verboten. I would suggest actually that the Xi Jinping government at this point in time actually is in many ways more like what the Kuomintang attempted to do in its years of state building in the mid 1930s, when it ran campaigns, not very well, but it ran campaigns to, on the one hand, get people to be orderly and disciplined and patriotic and so forth, but without popular mobilization. And it didn't work very well for them. And the technological base now in China is much stronger. The surveillance is incredible. And so you can get people to comply with all kinds of rules because largely of some combination of surveillance, but also, frankly, patriotism. There is no alternative to the Chinese Communist Party. And so people do support it for patriotic reasons. They do support it because they see the standard of living has vastly improved in the last generation. The degree to which this will continue is unclear, but there's now much more surveillance than there was before. So it's very, very difficult to know exactly what's going on. But the indication, all the indications that I've seen is that there is actually a very high degree of support for the Chinese Communist Party for a variety of reasons. This said, the campaign, this nexus of campaign and bureaucracy has not gone away, not at all. There are periodic upsurges in anti-corruption campaigns. There are campaigns for public health. There are campaigns for environmental awareness. There are all kinds of campaigns that are continuing, that are ongoing. It is still a technique. It is still a set of repertoires deployed by the state that are very well understood. The most extreme campaign that we've seen of late have actually been public health campaigns. Campaigns to literally close off however many tens of millions of people once the central government once there was a breakthrough in the central government, realized how serious SARS, COVID was. And in closing down, the better, half of a whole province. And then having just the logistics of having to keep people in their homes and feed them. I mean, it was incredible. An incredible nationwide campaign that was mounted to enforce this and to support this logistically. So there are many different kinds of campaigns, but campaigns as a technique of governance and policy implementation are still very, very much with us. In Taiwan, since there's been democratization in Taiwan, and we have an opposition, the opposition party has now been in power twice, and it still is in power at present, it's more difficult to directly trace the lineage. But I would argue, yes, that there is an impact as well, even though in the early 1950s, the regime in Taiwan was martial, and it was authoritarian, it was repressive, and life in Taiwan is anything but those things these days. What I would argue is that in Taiwan, though, there is real continued respect for the rules and for law. People take legal rulings very seriously. People follow rules and law. There's very little actual flouting of this. They care a great deal about elections because, well, elections are performative and they're fun, but also it's through elections that laws are passed, that people in Taiwan are much, much more attuned to politics, but also law and rules than their counterparts in many other parts of the world, in many other parts of the democratic world. So I would suggest that there is an ongoing respect for rules and law in Taiwan that that certainly dates, at least in part, from this legacy, and probably goes back even earlier to the Japanese colonial period. So
it's very interesting. I mean, I especially liked sort of this idea that the current moment potentially has a lot of echoes with the Guomindang past. I mean, even sort of thematically, when we look at a lot of the content of the new propaganda of the new era, there's a lot of sort of Jiang Jie's, China meme, etc. So it's very interesting. And that sort of leads me to the next question, which is whether you could expand a bit in terms of your explanation of the parallelism that we see in those cases in the early 1950s, because is it just simply a consequence of both of them were facing situations of insecurity as Leninist orders? Or was there also some type of cross-strait learning taking place? Because, there's sort of that Eric Hobsbawm interpretation where the democracies or other sort of non-communist regimes had learned from the socialist orders, the creation of socialist welfare, imitation of land reform. That was certainly the case in Taiwan and South Korea. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a bit on that.
Right. I would say that the main thing that you see in the People's Republic of China in the early 1950s is extraordinary vigor and extraordinary self-confidence. Remember, these are people that won the Civil War far earlier than they ever imagined would be the case. And so they were the Maoist repertoire, including these kinds of campaigns and public performances, was vindicated by incredibly rapid military success. So there was a very substantial amount of self-confidence and dynamism in what the leaders of the People's Republic of China were doing in the 1950s, because it was a miracle. I mean, it was a miracle. It was a vindication. So why not apply these techniques to really all of China when it had been so successful? Whereas in Taiwan, it was the exact opposite. The people who arrived in Taiwan, they were utterly traumatized by having lost the Civil War. Many of them had been retreating for over a year. They arrived in this island where they didn't even speak the local language, utterly ruined financially. They had no place to live. They had no money. They had nothing. So what we see is actually not the learning that went on in the early 1950s in the People's Republic of China was very explicit learning in terms of establishing central plans and and Stalinist institutions in the People's Republic of China. So the learning in the People's Republic of China in this period was all from the Soviet Union, insofar as there was learning. But in Taiwan, they kept an eagle eye on everything that was going on across the strait. And they realized that they needed to implement many of the same kinds of policies, like, for example, land reform. But at every stage along the way, they felt the need to differentiate themselves from the way, not not the need for land reform and not the results of land reform, but the way in which land reform was implemented. And so in my book, I have a whole long two chapters on exactly this, where I even cite this amazing document where people in the Kuomintang were discussing land reform and options for different kinds of land reform. And they literally had, if you go into the archives, you can sometimes get these oversized sheets where you roll it out like this several times, 1, 2, 3, and then you roll it out to the right several times, 1, 2, 3. And I kid you not, there was a document that I found where they were talking about the implementation of land to the tiller. And they had one column which said the Gongfei, the communist bandits over there did this and this and this and this and this. And therefore they had their own column right to the right of what the communists did. And therefore our options are not these 2 or 3 options, not that 2 or 3 options, not the next thing, 2 or 3 options. So this meshed, of course, with the kind of land reform that the United States was promoting, first in Japan, then Taiwan, and also in South Korea. So there was also heavy involvement of United States agricultural advisors. We would call them agricultural economists, but back then they were just called agronomists. And their Chinese counterparts in an organization called the Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction. And it was a strange sort of hybrid organization where, you had an American advisor and a Chinese in having co-equal status. But there's never any tension between these two groups of people because the Chinese had all been to the same graduate PhD programs in agronomy as the Americans. They'd all trained in agronomy at Cornell, like all of them. So they spoke the same language, quite literally. They spoke the same language, and they had the same kind of presets. And there's been a lot of attention placed on the gradualist, American influenced approach to land reform. But in my view, I'm sorry, it was staged, but these, especially the land to the tiller, this was a campaign. It's never called a campaign, but if you look at what was done, it was definitely a campaign. But it was a campaign that needed to differentiate itself from the kinds of campaigns that were going on in the People's Republic of China at the same time. So when you look at the records of the Joint Commission on Rural Reconstruction of the early 1950s, you would never guess that a vicious white terror was going on at exactly the same time. You would just never guess that, but it was. So when we get back to this whole question of the current moment, there's a real downplaying of campaign in the Republic of China, Taiwan, that sort of lasts until now. I mean, the campaigns that you see are sort of electoral campaigns, which come by very frequently, but not so much other kinds of campaigns. You see that historical legacy of campaigns as a technique of governance and policy implementation much more in the People's Republic of China. But this is not surprising because this was a technique that was, it's part of the formative DNA of the Chinese Communist Party. They're not going to give it up. They've been unable to give it up, even in the post-1978 era, with anti-crime campaigns and anti-corruption campaigns and public health campaigns and so forth, and party rectification campaigns, which never amounted very much. But in Taiwan, since there was never an acknowledgement that what was going on was a campaign anyway, even though it was, by my criteria, you would have to look for it harder, and you'd probably look in different places.
Interesting, very interesting. I'm actually now also thinking about whether there was an indirect legacy on Saudi's agricultural development, because Saudi was one of the recipients of the aid and support from Taiwan under the Vanguard operation in the early 1960s. So they sent all these agricultural experts to the kingdom during that period. It'd be interesting to examine.
Okay. That sounds great. Let's write a paper on it. I can read the Chinese, you can read the Arabic.
Well, hopefully. There's a few questions that have popped up from the audience.
Sure, of course.
One question is from Bandar al-Ghamdi.
Mhm.
Were women and men equally targeted by state power consolidation? Sort of an additional question is what roles were given to the academy in both regimes and sort of supporting and these campaigns and
Right. Okay. So to the first question, women were largely, well, it varied. In the People's Republic of China, women participated in campaigns, but their participation tended to be limited to being the accuser. The Chinese Communist Party wanted to mobilize the emotions and the sympathy of the crowd, and therefore the accusers of counter-revolutionaries were handpicked, pre-chosen, and coached with full dress rehearsals in some cases. And they were never, ever able-bodied men, ever. The people who were chosen to be accusers were the very young, the very old, the disabled, and women. And and typically it was women who lost husbands or who lost fathers or who lost livelihoods. There were more women than these other categories, at least from the impressionistic evidence that I've seen. So women would be in the crowd. Women would be accusers. It was extremely rare that women would be the accused. And in land reform, which was used the same techniques, it was ongoing at the same time in Sunan as the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries. When they couldn't find enough landlords, they would sometimes, because they had quotas, right? So they had to substitute. If they couldn't find local bullies and evil gentry, when sometimes they couldn't, they had to substitute. And this was a very bad practice because this lost the sympathy of the masses when the mothers and grandmothers of accused counter-revolutionaries as little old ladies were put on stage and subjected to this kind of abuse. And when school children, when schoolboys, i.e. the sons of counter-revolutionaries or landlords, were put on stage, there were some instances of this happening. And when this happened, local cadres were severely criticized because it didn't work. You could not get the sympathy of the crowd if you put an innately sympathetic character on stage as the accused. You couldn't whip up the sympathy of the masses. Instead, the natural sympathies went to the accused because they were vulnerable. So yes, there was passive participation, but in terms of active participation, only as accuser, almost never as accused, if that makes sense. Now, were women affected in other ways? Absolutely. They may not have been put on stage, but the accused were almost always able-bodied men of varying ages, often middle-aged, able-bodied men. And so these men would have been the source of financial support for women and their families. This is a period of time in which there's almost no such thing as an unmarried woman in China of marriageable age. And the same was true in Taiwan. You suddenly have your main breadwinner and husband disappeared. So your son has disappeared, your husband has disappeared, your father has disappeared, and you don't know what's happened to them for a long period of time. Because of course, and even in the PRC, there would be incarceration for a lengthy period of time before the public accusation session. And you lose your livelihood, and also you would be socially shunned. So your previous friends would hesitate to have anything to do with you or to speak to you. So how you were going to survive under these circumstances was very, very unclear. And it was excruciatingly difficult for women and children, for the people who were left, because there was the loss of livelihood, and there was also active social isolation and social shunning of entire families. And there, in fact, is even a 3-volume set on exactly this for the White Terror in Taiwan. I'll write about this at some time. And the title of this is called literally A Prison Without Walls, to describe the situation that the women and children found themselves in as, in effect, an outcast minority. It was really pretty excruciating. And I've lost track of what the next question was. What was the next question?
It was sort of the role of the academy.
Okay, role of the academy. This gets tricky because it varied, and many academics were suspect ideologically. In fact, most were probably suspect ideologically. And so this was a period of relatively patient re-education until 1953. And then there was a thought reform campaign that really inflicted in a very harsh way Marxist-Leninist reasoning and approaches and frameworks on academics. For the campaign to suppress counter-revolutionaries, very unclear. It probably would have varied according to individual circumstances. I suspect that many individuals were scared because they may very well have been friends or had relations who were accused counter-revolutionaries. They would have been moving in the right kinds of circles for that in 1949, 1950, 1951. In Taiwan, a bit less so, because in Taiwan, the universities were being reorganized at this point in time. They were being taken over. There were a couple of universities that had departments that had noted networks or cells of communists or accused communists. We don't really know whether they were communists or not. So there was a wholesale sort of purging of the left and leftist thought in Taiwan, because Taiwan didn't have that many universities then. It only really had two, plus the Academia Sinica, which was in the process of being reset up, but it hadn't been set up yet by the early 1950s. That came a little bit later, in the mid to late 1950s, when it got new buildings and it was brought up to strength and so forth and so on. So in Taiwan, you only had two universities. And these two universities had actually been hotbeds of resistance and complaining, and an abortive student movement actually that kicked off the White Terror in the summer of 1949. So there was great suspicion of universities. There was increasing political control of universities, and there were purges, at least in some departments, of two of the major universities. And I suspect that this had a chilling demonstration effect on the people who remained, especially as, and this is often not remarked on, but the Kuomintang established, these are the years in which the Kuomintang established a really pervasive informant state. And so every university department would have had informers, but you wouldn't know who the informers were. So there's a whole network of surveillance that came into all of the work units. This would have been universities, it would have been factories, it would have been all government organizations of secret reporting, very, very much like East Germany, with very, very high penetration level. Post was monitored, phones were tapped. People wrote reports on their colleagues, and you couldn't be sure who was an informer and who wasn't. So there was very little social trust. So again, what we see in Taiwan is the breaking apart of bonds of solidarity and social isolation. And in the case of the People's Republic of China, there is an explicit effort to bring people together as a collective, but as a collective that does what the party state wants. And of course, it doesn't always work out that way.
I mean, ultimately, the thrust is the same. It's sort of an ongoing process of automation, but sort of bringing people together around a united leadership.
Yeah.
There's one last question, since we're running out of time. This one comes from Naif Al-Hawas. Thank you for a great presentation, and I wish you a good health. I have a question the question is, why did the Taiwanese government, or the Kuomintang, not choose to execute people publicly, but instead in a secret government space?
Right.
How did they deal with the families of the people who were executed?
Right. That's a very good question. They tried to conceal it. Remember, in the case of Taiwan, it was all about removal of the individual from society and the sequestration of the individual from society behind prison walls. Very limited information about what happened going in or out. Very limited indeed. And in fact, it was only by rumor. So early on, very, very early on in the White Terror, the government sort of made the mistake of conducting executions in public. And this engendered great sympathy for the accused. People were horrified. There was an innate natural, remember, this is an imposed alien government that nobody likes, that the local Taiwanese population despises. So quite naturally, the majority of the population was going to feel sympathy for the accused, even if the accused himself was a mainlander. This was a despised, imposed government that had really mismanaged the economy. Only 2 years previously, it had carried out a major set of massacres against an island-wide uprising. So this is only 2 or 3 years after this. So this is a despised government that's imposed and ruling by force, sheer force of arms and coercion. And so the government made the mistake of having a few executions in a very public place, and the widespread revulsion and horror against the government, with public wailing and screaming and crying, and the crowd coming around and comforting the relative. You couldn't be having that. So they set up a set of prisons in kind of shadowy locations on the outskirts of town. And they had a major execution ground to the southeast of the city, which actually is now a stop on one of the main public transport underground overground lines. But back then it was only like whispered about, and it officially didn't exist as a place, but of course it was a place. And I do have some documentation of a few examples of people getting wind that their husbands and sons were on their way out to be taken to this execution yard, with families getting wind of something happening, and then literally following the trucks as far as they could go, screaming and wailing and, hoping for a glimpse of their sons and husbands. But mostly they tried to keep this quiet and out of sight and officially not happening at all. Probably because of the widespread sympathy that would have been engendered for the accused. This was a very, very heavy-handed, not very nice government. Why did they choose not to execute the public? Was there a second part to that question? I think there was.
How did they engage with the families of the executed?
They engaged with the families of the executed, often by silence. Occasionally, eventually, usually long after a sentencing and execution taken place, they would issue a legal document of the case, about the resolution of the case, what the accused had been accused of, and then the sentencing. It's a document called a panjue that would then eventually be given to the family of the executed, or of the families of the accused. Remember, not everyone was executed. Lots of people were executed, and it was a very haphazard business in some ways in the early 1950s. but the majority of people were not executed. They were incarcerated, and then eventually, and then they set up prison systems on, remote islands, and, basically work prisons. It was horrible. But they set up a bureaucratic system of eventual rehabilitation, of kind of halfway houses for the accused that hadn't been executed, where, very much like the People's Republic of China, you lived in a dorm. There were small group meetings. You had to write diaries that were then checked by a monitor to indicate how serious your repentance was and whether you were properly fit to go back into regular society and so forth. So many of the techniques of, quote, rehabilitation were more or less identical to similar techniques in the People's Republic of China at the same time.
So interesting. I encourage the audience, if they're really eager to sort of expand their knowledge, to look up Dr. Strauss's book, State Formation in China and Taiwan, Bureaucracy, Campaign, and Performance, published in 2019, if I believe.
Yes, end of 2019. So yeah, just about 2 years ago.
Well, on behalf of the King Faisal Center, I'd really like to thank you for your time and sharing with us your insights drawn from the book and from this extensive research. I'd also like to thank the team for setting up all of this.
Yes, did a great job.
And I also encourage the audience to keep an eye on our social media platforms for future events that will be ongoing. And again, I reiterate my thanks to you, Dr. Strauss.
Not at all.
Goodbye, and
Bye.
see you soon.
Yeah.